Still good morning to everyone. It's about 5 minutes to noon, so not good afternoon, but good morning. And thank you for inviting me to speak before all of you. And my compliments and also so much encouragement to the organizers for this event to carry out such a wonderful event over so many weekends. It's quite remarkable, and also thank you for participation for all of you also. I'm sure you would have learned a lot over this number of weekends that have been spent on understanding the spectrum of knowledge that's been shared by the speakers. In front of me, of course, is a subject that you would have over a period of time understood. Fortunately for us, in this year, at least this transfer pricing cycle, we have not seen new controversies coming up as much as in the last couple of years we see spate of new controversies that came up. This reminds me of what happens in the cricket arena at this point of time. We have the IPL going on, and we as part of Mumbai Indians would be our favorite. Just like the tax department, has been vehemently trying to score runs over here, but successfully is losing cases left, right, and center. Large controversy getting resolved in favor of the taxpayer. If I go back and see what has happened for the last 3 decades, and she mentioned that I've been practicing as a tax profession for the last 3 decades. My experience is that it's always been the taxpayers and the tax profession for that matter who are very inventive about how to save taxes for the clients and for the taxpayers. And that's been our DNA, if I put it this way, but I think in transfer pricing the roles are reversed. And it is now for the transfer pricing officials to discover new ways of finding how to tax a taxpayer and discover new controversies as we go forward. So I think that's a big change out here, how the transfer pricing is practiced in India. So the roles are reversed. The taxpayers are mute witnesses to what is happening over here. They've been dished out subjects and controversies successively on different issues. Fortunately, some of them get resolved in their favor, but they're dragged into longer of litigation and also big tax demands as we see. But the net loser in this whole situation is the Indian economy, because it doesn't give a good impression to foreign investors as we seek investment, we seek FDI, that we have a very controversial transfer pricing career in India. So I think that's unfortunate outcome of what's happening in India. Having said that, I will just quickly take you through what has happened with the experience of transfer pricing in a couple of slides, and then we'll move on and deep dive into the controversies that are there. As we know, the transfer pricing law has been in India for the last 14 years. So we have seen 14 cycles of transfer pricing compliance that we've seen, and also includes 12 cycles of transfer pricing audit. We started with the regulations in 2001 based on the OECD model. Somewhere there has been some bit of divergence in what has happened in India. India is in fact raced ahead of the world in how the law is developed in India. So we have dealing provisions which otherwise you would not find in the OECD model or even in the UN transfer pricing model for that matter. Very unfortunate positioning that is taken by the tax authorities is that they take transfer pricing as a revenue generating regulation, which is not there in any part of the world. Is that transfer pricing is an anti-avoidance law, is that the position is not that you can generate revenue, because the revenue generation happens when companies file their tax returns and the tax is paid as a self-assessment or advance tax on the taxable income. And all that you need to do with transfer pricing is to comply with the regulations and comply with the benchmarking, and by itself it cannot generate revenue. As opposed to that, Indian transfer pricing officers have been given revenue targets, which has been something that is unprecedented in the world. Is that nowhere in the world you would see transfer pricing officers given revenue targets for something which is an anti-avoidance law. But that's how transfer pricing is practiced in our country, is that officers are given targets for transfer pricing demands to be made. In effect, what you say at the outset is that you will create demands out of litigation, which is unfortunate as a tenet of the law. This is not something that should really be acceptable to us as Indian citizens. But unfortunately, this is how transfer pricing has been practiced up until now. There have been adjustments which are made in a high number of cases we have seen in the last few years. There has been a cascading curve that we will see in the next slide. The demands kept on increasing for a period of time. Fortunately, there has been a trend reversal in the last 2 years, as we'll see. What fortunately also has happened is that we have developed a very efficient appellate and judicial dispute resolution mechanism, So we have a very efficient appellate mechanism, which is now of course complemented by the APA regime, which has been there for the last 3 years now. And in a sense, this is to alleviate the problem of the taxpayers, where the uncertainty which is there in transfer pricing ought to get resolved. And finally, almost all, if I see the trend that has been there in the jurisprudence, is that we end up seeing almost one decision getting rolled out on transfer pricing every day, which is huge. The amount of jurisprudence on transfer pricing that India creates is unprecedented. Again, we probably lead the world in the number of decisions that get rolled out in transfer pricing. And the world actually looks up to us for many number of things, including the inventive ways in which the tax department creates new issues. And I think that's what is, I would say, a trendsetter for the world. Having said that, yes, we have a plethora of cases of transfer pricing. We all track those which is relevant to our practice. This is the landscape of transfer pricing, as you all probably are aware as tax practitioners and followers of what's happening in transfer pricing. In this slide, you will see the trend of how the demands have been created over a period of years. It started with a benign adjustment for assessment year 2002-03 at 1,220 crores at the top of the table. Then gradually it reached a peak in 2012-13 assessment transfer pricing audit year, that is for assessment in 2009-10, and the adjustments made were 17,000 crores. 13 and 14, of course, has been said, as I said, there's been a slight bit of a trend reversal. I think now they're getting a little more pronounced at 47,000 crores in 2014-15. So, in a sense, healthy that this was never expected that this demand would be created. And as I said, it started with the wrong premise. The tax transfer pricing officers were supposed to create tax demands on something that was an anti-avoidance law. And by and large, if the positions of corporates is that they have met with the arm's length test, there should be no demand as such, because they're not this is not a tax-paying subject. It is just a compliance and a anti-avoidance measure. Having said that, the demands are unprecedented in transfer pricing. Of course, the follow-up is that most of these demands are not collected at this point of time. Whole of them is in dispute, more or less, if I put it that way. So, despite the fact there is so much effort on the part of the tax transfer pricing authorities and the taxpayers and the tax professionals, we are not seeing anything that is tangibly happening in terms of anything translating into tax recovery as such. I think that's again the lopsided development on this particular subject. But of course, we also seen that AP has been introduced. There are almost 500 cases which are pending with the authorities at this point of time, subject to the rulings. And I think we also see the trend towards more and more towards APA now. Fortunately, in the domain of resolving disputes even before they arise, this should be very welcome. Hopefully, we will see efficiency coming in this particular option of dispute resolution, and probably we have some more resounding transfer pricing regime as we go forward. With these few words, I will deep dive into the subject of the critical issues that I have identified, and all of you must be aware of these subjects. We have advertising and marketing and promotion expenses, AMP, as we all understand. This has been a huge controversy in the transfer pricing domain for the last three to 4 years. The number of decisions that have come in about, and the unsettling trend that we have seen with decisions that have come in different directions. I think this subject is probably the most important subject in transfer pricing in terms of the impact that it has on the taxpayers. Then we also have the situation of location savings, infusion of share capital, recharacterization of transactions, intragroup services, selection of foreign tested party, and finally deep international transactions. I've captured 7 different subjects to bring up for you for discussion, and as well as I'll give some views of what has happened on this particular subjects in terms of the jurisprudence that we have seen. So let's start with the first one. As I said, advertising, marketing and promotion expenses is clearly the biggest controversy in transfer pricing that is there. It impacts our large section of taxpayers. It starts with the taxpayers into distribution and marketing using a brand of a foreign name, and those pays PP adjustments. So if I relate back to saying what really happens here is that if you are a distributor or manufacturer and if you're using a foreign brand, the legal owner of this brand is not you yourself but a foreign entity, then you are covered with this particular subject. AMP is something that you should be aware of. Let's go and simplify this. For example, if there is a foreign brand which is in distribution of foreign luxury products in India, and they are spending on advertising to promote the brand in India or to promote the products in India to the benefit of providing visibility for their sales in India and what they have offered to the customers in India. But whatever amount they spend on the advertising, marketing and promotion, all of this will be subject to this particular controversy at this point of time. So the coverage of this subject is very wide. What is really set out by the transfer pricing official is that the excessive AMP expenses requires compensations for brand development services that you would have possibly provided for to the legal owner of the brand. That's the big challenge over here. The tax officials believe that anything over and above that is a normal expense that you spend for AMP for a brand creation, which is you are not the legal owner. This amount is a service that you render to the entity which owns a brand, and therefore you should be compensated for these expenses along with a markup. So the tax officers applied bright line test as a method to look at what is the excessive amount which is there, and this bright line test, as we all probably are aware of, became a big issue in terms of how to benchmark the AMP expenditure. What was routine expenses, what was non-routine expenses, this became a big controversy. And it's a very simple way of looking at it. If I may just take you through this example in front of you. So there is a sales of a taxpayer which is 1,000, and the AMP expense of it incurred by the taxpayer is 100, which is actually 10% of the turnover. As opposed to that, the AMP expenses in the sales ratio of the comparable companies is 4%. That is, what our competitor spending is only 4%, as opposed to the entity in front of us spend 10% of the total revenue as AMP expenditure. Effectively saying that 6% of the expenditure, that is 60, is the excess AMP, that is non-routine AMP expenditure, and this is something that, in a sense, is brand development service that you render to the foreign entity. That being said, not only that, because since you have actually spent 60 on behalf of your AE, you should also recover a markup on that. And presuming that the markup is 15%, you should actually recover 69 rupees or 69 from the situation as this. So this was the bright line test that was adopted by tax officials in most of the AMP cases. And believe me, this is one particular law is uniformly practiced across India. Is that you may find that the transfer pricing officer, the position he takes in Mumbai, would be identical to the position that would be taken by a transfer pricing officer in Delhi or Chennai for that matter. This does not happen to the income tax law. Is that most of the tax officer may end up taking position which is more fact specific, and despite there could be a common thread of those facts, the positions taken by the officers at the time of assessment may not be uniform. For example, 14A could be, the calculation could have been done differently. The math could be perceived differently in terms of the way the calculation is done, based on the facts probably. So there could be nuances which are different, which could be factual, as well as in a manner that the officer may interpret at the point of time when the assessment is passed. But when it comes to transfer pricing, it is uniformly practiced across India, because there is a collective effort to see that every transfer pricing officer speaks the same language. So there is a uniformity of thought process over here. It's almost regimental that the transfer pricing officer has to follow this diktat of the revenue authorities in how the controversy will be created. That being said, in this particular example, the demand of the disallowance or the additions that could be made to the income of the taxpayer would be 69, and that's been the bright line test that was there. This, of course, went on, and there was a special bench which took a decision in the case of LG Electronics in Delhi ITAT. This is reported in 29 Taxman 300. So essentially, this approach was operated by the special bench of this bright line test. But of course, it did not end there. We now have the decision of Sony Ericsson, or Sony India as we now call it, which was reported in 55taxman.com. So this is again a landmark decision which of course defined new rules of how AMP would be looked at. It also negated some of the findings of the special bench in the case of LG Electronics. So what is the, so let's go through what the decision has to say. So number one is that AMP is an international transaction. AMP is an expense is an international transaction, even though AMP incurred in India and paid to a third party. Now that's a little incongruous here for a layman to understand, is that how come a payment made to a third party, which where there is no international, or there is no foreign entity involved or associated enterprise involved, how come this could be recognized as an international transaction? But the Delhi High Court has held that AMP, despite the fact it is paid to a third party, would still be recognized as international transaction and therefore subject to transfer banking regulations.
So, but what is the logic given by the High Court for treating it as an international transaction?
The logic is that, effectively speaking, this AMP is an element of expenditure. So it is not disregarding the principle that AMP is actually when the legal owner is not yourself, and that means a brand who is owned by a foreign entity, and you incur this expenditure, this amount is actually expended for a foreign entity. So that's not taken away from here. So that's the basis on which all the decisions, including what the transfer bank office has been containing up until now, that AMP is something you spend for your foreign entity. It is not something that you spend for yourself, because the benefit of this amount that you spend, you are not the legal owner of the brand, and therefore if you are spending your foreign entity, this should be an international transaction. That's the, I would say, the genesis of this particular thought process.
But in case of a full-fledged risk-bearing distributor, whether the same logic is applicable, because he is saying that I am doing it for myself. I mean, I am bearing the entire risk. If something goes wrong, in spite of incurring huge AMP expense, then I am liable to bear that loss, not my AE. So whether the same logic will apply to even a risk-bearing distributor?
I think not only that, it can apply to almost every situation where an AMP is there. So when you say there is a limited risk distributor, you would say there is a full-fledged risk-bearing entity as a distributor, there is a licensed manufacturer. All of these entities, whatever they spend as an AMP, for a brand which is not their own, which is the legal owner is outside of India, would be considered as an AMP expenditure subject to transfer banking.
Those when High Court has given such a striking observation that they are exploiting the brand, they are not promoting the brand. Then right. How can such, I mean... So
there are various ways of looking at it, but I think for now, I think the wisdom is to sit back and say that AMP is an expenditure which is subject to transfer banking. In a sense, this controversy which you raise, and I think it's justifiable, because you may want to take a stand that I'm actually spending for myself, and I will take the risk if this brand does not really fructify in terms of translating into sales. And at no point of time, the foreign entity is going to recompense for the expense that I've made. Therefore, truly speaking, this is an amount that I spent for myself. But that's been the genesis of this particular subject right from the beginning, is that this is a contention that was put up even at the time when Maruti Udyog case came up, which is the first of this kind, that this was actually spent for the company itself and never spent for the foreign entity. But I think that seems to go in the background of the situation at this point of time, because the accepted position at this point of time is that AMP is actually, where the legal owner is outside India, is an expenditure that you incur for your associated enterprises, and I think that is a starting point for this particular subject as we kind of analyze how to go forward. So yes, a view can be taken, and I think view has been taken, but I am not of the view that anyone has concurred with this view to say that yes, we would accept that AMP that you expend, and because it's a very fact-based situation here, is that despite the claim that we make, and I think no commercial arrangement between a foreign supplier versus an Indian counterpart, there would be a clause to say that we will recompense an AMP expenditure we incur. So that's never the case. So factually speaking, commercially speaking, what you would say is a right argument, but I think the acceptance is not coming through, because the allegation is that you're spending for someone else, and that's not you. You are not the legal owner. And I'll come to it a little later, because what of course the special bench in the case of LG Electronics held, there's nothing like an economic ownership, which was the main argument which was disregarded by the LG Electronics case. And of course this Sony India's case has now brought it back into the fold, is that there is a concept called of economic ownership which is recognized internationally, including in the OECD, which is disregarded by the special bench, which is brought into the reckoning again. I think that's very welcome to say that there is a concept like economic ownership of a brand, that the benefit of the economic ownership is with you as you create the expenditure in India. And I think as we move forward, we'll see that how this really translates into practical challenges, and also opportunities to really overcome this particular subject as we, as taxpayers or as a tax advisor, we would like to take it to our clients.
Milind,
Sure.
I'm not privy to the arguments in this case, but has anyone argued that AMP is never on a linear scale?
You increase your expense by maybe 10%, your sales may increase by 50%, or you decrease by 10%, it may drop by 50%. Actually, a study was done by Colgate years ago on this issue. So, has anyone brought up this argument, number one?
In my view, this argument has been brought up in different ways, multiple different ways, before different tax authorities, but none of them has really gone well, if I may put it that way, because this has been also the trend internationally also that has been argued in different ways, that what are they actually spending for, and it starts with Glaxo's case, who benefits from this brand and what is the contribution of the distributor in a sense of that. Unfortunately, I can't seem to think that there is a convergence of thought process to go with what everyone understands commercially, that there is never going to be recompense for the AMP in a conventional sense as we would understand, and what the taxpayer is, the tax authorities may want to demand. For example, if I just go back to this example, this 69 that is contended that should be recovered as an arm's length price from the international, in the international transaction from an is non-existential commercially. No one,
Just out of thin air.
yeah, this is something that is only existing on a transfer pricing concept. This is not a commercial reality. But that being said, there are derivatives of that, and we'll see how it is actually now interpreted by the Delhi High Court. And I think that's really interesting to understand. It probably resolves so many practical challenges we go, so we'll see that as we go.
One more thing.
Sure.
You know, main component of AMP is generally media, print and television.
Quite right.
Now, as an admin, I know if my
Comparable is, say, the Tata Group. Okay? He gets a prime spot at, say, 75,000. Because I am a small person, I have to pay 2 lakhs for that very same spot, same time at prime time.
Quite
So
right.
strictly speaking, even the spend is not comparable.
No, nothing is comparable.
So how can you say, okay, he spends 75, so you should also spend 75 excess?
Quite right.
AMP.
So even now, even after all of this, that the decision of the Delhi High Court has been delivered in the case of Sony India, it still leaves many questions behind. It doesn't answer everything in this domain. For example, this particular decision of Sony is, sorry. It only deals with the situation of a distributor, not of a manufacturer. So the licensed manufacturer is still not being dealt with by the Delhi High Court. So there is a big area which is still left open, number one. So that's going to be sometime before we see resolution of all disputes and clarity on the subject, how AMP will be dealt with. But it does remain a very important subject. The Delhi High Court decision has resolved a fair degree of uncertainty on this particular part. What seemed to be the Ajit Electronics case, which was seeming absolutely against the taxpayer, some of them, or a large part of it, is resolved in favor of the taxpayer. So there is some more clarity here how we can actually practice the law. Despite it seems,
clarify
sorry.
that point again about the manufacturer and distributor,
Sure,
because there seems to be a lot of confusion, different case laws saying different things.
quite right. So since this point has been raised, and I think the decision in the case of Sony India was in the case of a distributor, and we can go back to the Maruti Suzuki's case, which was the question of a licensed manufacturer. I think these are the two distinctive perspectives that can be seen at this point of time. Is that what is a distributor? Sony India was a distributor because it was importing products from Sony, the Japanese corporation, bringing it to India and selling it as a distributor. So it had a different role to play. The entire AMP that was being spent, as it has been argued, was for the creation of the brand which was belonging to someone else. So that was the concept as a distributor. Insofar as Maruti Suzuki's case is concerned, it was a licensed manufacturer, and therefore it is in a much different wicket. So the principles that are applied in the case of Sony India should not necessarily be applied for Maruti Suzuki, and there are 3 elements of that. And the approach which is there is, can you apply a TNMM method to benchmark the business of Maruti Suzuki, considering that there is an AMP expenditure over here, going by the fact that there are certain things that are held in the decision. What's come about is that there are 3 elements of how to look at this particular part. There is an import of raw material which should be benchmarked as a separate transaction. The second is a royalty to be paid for the use of the brand. And third is a profit that is made that should be done on a profit split basis. So the argument that has been put up, or what is being canvassed now as a takeaway for us is that in such situations you should do a transition to transaction analysis of the international transactions and not leave it to only T&M. And that's the difference which has been made out. And since you are on this subject, I might just, out of context, read you a paragraph what the Delhi High Court said in the context of Maruti Suzuki. So Maruti admittedly was not a distributor for the products manufactured by Suzuki. It was a licensed manufacturer of these products and had entered into a long-term agreement with Suzuki. Therefore, it was justified in incurring substantial expenditure on marketing, promotion and advertising of its products, even under the joint trademark Maruti Suzuki and using the logo of Suzuki. Since the products promoted and advertised by Maruti were being manufactured and sold solely by it and Suzuki had no right to sell any product under the joint trademark Maruti Suzuki, the benefits from the expenditure incurred on marketing, promotion and advertising of Maruti products under the joint trademark Maruti Suzuki would accrue to Maruti, and the status of Maruti is therefore not comparable to that of a distributor. This is what Delhi High Court had to say about this particular subject, is that the status of Maruti was very different. It was a licensed manufacturer and not a distributor. And you can't compare these two different, how would I say, the dimensions of business, if I put it that way. So, going back to the slide which is in front of us. So, Indian taxpayers need to be compensated for A&P expense and marketing services to AEs. That's what the High Court had to say, is that it did not overrule the concept that A&P is non-existential, although we all just touched upon the fact that commercially it is actually non-existential, but from a theory perspective it is existential from a transfer pricing perspective, no less. The next is the application of BLT. So BLT cannot be adopted to determine ALP, which is a huge plus for the taxpayer. Is that something that was being used left, right and center against the taxpayer, this right line test method to find out what is non-routine expenditure is something that is disregarded, that this cannot be used. The High Court came out pretty hard on this subject to say this is not there at all in the regulation. So how come every tax office is talking about right line test method as an application to find out non-routine expense? Because there has to be regulation to support what you do. There is no regulation to speak of that supports this theory of right line test. So we are, I think, in my view, we are almost seeing the end of right line test method insofar as AMP is concerned. From a tax department perspective, the use of this is almost, in my view, now almost diluted and gone and over with, is my view at this point of time. But of course, as I said, department is overactive in finding out different ways to look at how to look at these expenses. So we might see some other shades of it coming in different ways, but we need to wait for that. So parameters of the special bench decision in the case of LG is set aside to this extent that you cannot use the right line test method. So in the earlier example where we discussed that 69 could have been the amount that should be ALP insofar as the non-routine expense is concerned, is no more a subject that should be looked upon as a starting point. Then again, after that, very interesting observation of the Delhi High Court. So there is a concept of aggregation that has been said over here. There is a single line of business where there is a distribution and marketing functions are interlinked and closely connected. Compensation for both the functions is as an aggregated package should be looked at. So this, I think, is a very important part for us to understand as taxpayers. Is that in that situation that we saw, is that there is a relationship which is the distribution relationship, where you need to have a certain margin at the end of the day, which you need to benchmark and justify the AMP which is there, number one. And for the marketing function which is AMP, you would need to justify, have a different justification, whether you spend your expenditure was routine or non-routine was something that was to be looked at. Here, what it says is that you can aggregate both of these together. Now, how does this really unfold? And I think going from what the comments we received and as we go forward, is that in the real world there is no recompense for the AMP, but how the recompense actually happens practically. And something that was discussed in the case of BMW even beforehand, which was distinguished, which distinguished the LG's case, is that the price that has been asked to pay, the Indian entity is being asked to pay, already takes into account that there is an AMP that is going to be spent by the Indian entity. So there is an embedding. There is an embedment inside the price itself. There is a discount to the price of the AMP that the Indian entity will actually expend in India as you start. So there is no separate profit and loss income item to be shown over here. So theoretically speaking, let's assume that there is an import of 100 and there could have been an AMP of 10 that you could have recovered. As opposed to that, the foreign entity is actually asking you to pay 90 as a net amount, which actually takes you to the same logical sense, which is actually how it is practiced in the world, is that no one actually recompenses AMP. And that being said, so this is a good way to go as far as the taxpayer is concerned. It clears how this could be practically resolved, is that as long as if you combine the margins that you have on the distribution and what you should have been paid for the brand creation as an AMP, as long as both of them put together, you are able to come up to a number which justifies the arm's length price, then you are in the clear. That's what it says. So that's a big benefit to the taxpayers to take from this decision. Then again, it also speaks of segregation of transactions. It may be permissible in facts and functional analysis if they warrant. And if it is segregated, that means if the distribution margin and the AMP is actually segregated, it is also a possibility if the facts so warrant. But of course, AMP function cannot be treated as nil as you separate. So you cannot contend as you separate the distribution and the marketing to say there is nothing to be attributed to the AMP as an expenditure, which is to be benchmarked for the purpose of AMP. So there's another finding of the or the observation of the High Court that is very material. And intentional set-offs and internationally recognized principle in TPP do not prohibit such set-offs. So even if you set off one against the other, is not something that is disregarded internationally. And also it is something that the High Court touched upon, saying intentional set-off is also a possibility when you segregate the transactions. So there is some clarity that has been brought about for the taxpayer, is that if you go by the bright line test method, you come to a position is that every Indian company would need to recover an AMP from its overseas entity. That's something that is not required. As long as you are able to aggregate and say the margins are still justified, you can move on and say, fine, you have been able to overcome the transfer pricing challenge. That despite the fact that there is an AMP being spent in India, you will be able to recover it by paying a lesser price for the import of goods. That's what it says.
So if you have a TNM method and you have the comparables are say 50% here and say 48% for you within the price range, then it's okay.
That's correct. So practically resolves many challenges. Otherwise, you would have to start a series of transactions of income, which is never an idea to start with.
And what is this intentional set-offs?
So intentional set-off meaning you set off a part of the, so in a sense you need to recompense for the AMP, but what you do is you don't recompense for AMP, but you actually less for the imports. That's the intentional set-off.
So, but whether a taxpayer has to prove that my import price is after considering the AMP expense,
yes,
or is it a blanket observation that you can aggregate the transaction?
No, so you can aggregate the transaction because in many cases you may not be able to actually separate them, but the tax officer may want to see what is the AMP spent over here as opposed to what is import. And as long as you are able to, when you aggregate these transactions of the purchase as well as the marketing spend, and collectively if you are able to say that you are able to get the margins that you want or the arm's length pricing being justified, then it's a possibility that the contention is right. So in other words, well, of course, transfer pricing officer may want to see what is the AMP, and as the High Court has said, you cannot say AMP is nil. Having said that, yes, it's a possibility.
So taxpayer does not have to prove that price is factored in the, AMP is factored into the price.
It actually happens as actually corollary, because as long as on the aggregation of transactions you are able to meet with the AMP test, it automatically premeditates it is already factored in the price.
No, I am saying the reverse, that a taxpayer does not have to prove that when I had fixed the price, my import price, I had considered the AMP as a part of the price.
Quite right. It is said to be considered because as in the earlier example which you mentioned is that presuming there is an import of 100 and there is a 10 which is the AMP embedded inside, so long as you pay 90 for the purchase and you spend 10 in India for the AMP, it comes to the same number. Is it clear? Or should I repeat this?
I understood, but only thing there can be two situations. One situation where there is a clear agreement that import price will be 100, but it is after considering the AMP expense which I will incur in India. So that is a very clear case where aggregation is allowed, because that is import price is after factoring the AMP. Second situation can be where there is no such agreement. So in the second situation where this aggregation is blanketly allowed.
Quite right. So I think I would go with the second.
Then that custom problem which
quite right. And I think I would go with the second as opposed to the first argument, to say that no agreement will ever specify that the price is reduced to recompense for the AMP, because as she very rightly put it, It could create other series of challenges, including customs, which would come around saying you are actually importing at a price which is lower than the fair market value, therefore there should be a larger customs duty impact as well. So it's not, I mean, unfortunately, the number of things that you need to contend, of course you can even theorize how things need to be done, but even if you say there's an income, what about the services implication as well? So I mean, there's nothing that gets resolved in one domain. There are multiple different challenges that need to be looked at, and I think very rightly customs implication also will be there. So going back to what you said, most agreements will, I would not say most, I would say 100% agreements will never specify that the price is lower because of AMP recompense.
When we can we report this in Form 3CB?
Now that's a challenge I think which is material. So we come to it and this is going to be a challenge as we go forward, because this is going to be a practical challenge. How do you report these transactions? Because if you are supposed to take AMPs and international transactions, you will need to report that as well. So in the light of all that has happened in the past, in this recent past, including this Solis decision, this is a practical reality that we would need to deal with.
So what is your suggestion? I mean, how we should go about it?
Well, if the judicial view on the subject is that AMP is an international transaction, do you have a choice not to report it as an international transaction anymore? My answer is there is no choice left for you. You need to report it as an international transaction.
But if we have spent say 10 crore rupees on our P&L account debit side, so whether we will report entire 10 crores or how we arrive at an amount?
I think these are some practical issues out here. Is that would you still say what is non-routine out of this or not? Because the view is that everything is AMP is international transaction. So the series of practical issues out here. I mean, I'm not in a, how would I say, this is not something that I can tell you without guard to say that, you can take a proportion of this or otherwise. I think my sense is you may want to report the entire AMP, but as so long as the margins are justified, it will not matter at the end of the day.
Can we say that our total AMP is say 100 rupees?
Quite right.
Which is of non-routine nature as our margins show. That the TNNM method correctly proves that our comparables are, the margins are comparable with any other entities,
Right.
and so then this is the entire thing is non-routine in nature.
Right. So just to go back to the how practically this unfold, let's just run it through an example and see what would really unfold in this situation. Is that let's presume that the AMP expense is 100. Now that the Brightline test is not there, you don't need to really classify that 40 out of this 100 is non-routine and 60 is routine. It's not required. So presuming you report the entire as an AMP, going by this High Court decision to say this is an international transaction, and if you aggregate with the purchase of 1,000, this 100 plus 1,000 is 1,100, is an international transaction, and as opposed to that, the margins that are there, considering this is an aggregation over here, it still justifies that there is nothing that the margins are in fact sufficient to justify the ambient price. I think you've done it. So there is, in my view, there is no need even to segregate the expenses to start with, unless someone has a different view. I personally believe the separation of expense to say what is routine and non-routine, which is the Brightline concept, is not necessary anymore, because the margins remain intact. Whether you say, well, in a situation it was 1,100 as an international transaction in that example that I gave you, or it was 1,040 and the margins remaining the same, would anything really turn on it? My answer is no. Right?
So we can just say that AMP total expense is 100,
Exactly.
which is all.
So this is the AMP which you consider as an international transaction. So I'm taking it as an international transaction, but as long as my margins are sufficient.
It's all routine.
Exactly.
We can
So you
give a
don't need to go
qualifier
into
or
this
something.
bifurcation of routine and non-routine, because then again there's a challenge. Is that there is even as you do that, what really turns on it? Nothing. If you honestly ask me.
Yeah, your margins will
They will be the same.
remain the same.
Exactly. So number one is benchmarking the AMP function if aggregated comparable companies to be performing similar functions, including the AMP function would be required as a starting point, as a requirement. Again, as you do this comparison, an important part is that comparable companies should not be the legal owners of the brand and trademark. So while you may not be the legal owner of the brand, it also premeditates that the competitor or the comparable that you use also should not have a legal ownership of the brand. Then otherwise the comparison itself is not starting on the equal footing. And if segregated, comparable for distribution to be pure distributors, not engaged in marketing. So if you're going to separate the distribution margin as well as the AMP margin, then you need to keep both separated at that point of time. And of course, it also canvasses the application of RPM, that is resale price method, which should be done while calculating the gross margins, and you should roll up the AMP expense as a part of the direct cost as you do the benchmarking. So that's the canvas of the benchmarking for AMP function in the light of this High Court decision, that practically we could take it back, saying how do we practically look at the situation as we report the transactions. Again, when you come to benchmarking of aggregation of transaction, there are practical difficulties when you look at RPM and TNM both in finding comparables, engaging both distribution and marketing, and not owning marketing intangibles. It's not an easy task. Even the curve method, difficulty in applying curve method, we will discover as an aggregation as we look at it. So these are some practical challenges that are there in this particular domain. Even when it comes to segregation, computing specific profitable indicators of the taxpayer, and again finding comparables, engaging pure distribution and pure marketing, challenges are there even for those as well.
What's the distinction between pure marketing and pure distribution?
So when we are saying pure distribution and pure marketing is that if you look at a distribution margin where you are not going to spend anything on AMP, then you are a pure distributor. You do not actually have a marketing function which could be alleged to be done on behalf of the legal owner, where it is a service that is rendered for brand service. So that's a pure distribution. There is no marketing element involved. And a pure marketing is without distribution as an element in isolation of that. Is that when I'm rendering a service to another customer or even to the heel, which is a marketing function. These are two different subjects over here. That's what he's trying to say. Is that pure marketing deals of pure distribution and vice versa.
But it will always be mixed.
That's right. So in case you want to segregate the transaction, then you need to justify both individually. That's what he's trying to say.
And even for this aggregation, can you just elaborate? Here there is a practical difficulty in finding comparable, engaging both distribution and marketing, and not owning marketing intangibles.
Correct.
So what actually High Court is trying to say? I mean, whether it has
No,
laid
this
down
is-
some guidance on.
No, this is something that are issues that are there for us to resolve at a practical level. The court has of course given that aggregation as a concept is acceptable. The question is very really come back to us to say, fine, aggregation is a possibility for us to look at to justify the transfer pricing benchmarks. Can we actually resolve it, go before the tax officer with the documentation to suggest that the benchmarks are being met with? So the practical challenge is threefold, is that you need to have a situation where there is both a marketing and a distribution combined as an entity, number one, and also that you should not be the legal owner. If this is a starting point and you find out a comparable which this kind of a, how would I say, the basic facts which are there of your particular taxpayer, can you get such comparables to look at? That's a big challenge out here. So if I have to put it that way. So it's not what the High Court has observed over here, but it's a practical challenge, even as what the High Court has put out over here as an aggregation is a principle that is agreed upon. Can we actually translate into a practical acceptable position from a transfer pricing perspective as we do the documentation? That's what I'm trying to put forward.
High Court has not given
No.
any observation.
No. High Court probably would not sit in judgment to say you have practical challenge on how to find benchmarking. That's something that's left to the taxpayers and the TPOs to really contend with.
One other complication is what happens when you use a composite mark or you use, say, a house mark and a product mark. Say, for example, GlaxoSmithKline and Crocin.
Correct.
GlaxoSmithKline is a foreign brand, Crocin is a local brand. Or
Quite
say
right.
Tata is used as Tata Salt by Tata Chemicals.
Quite right.
So what happens? How will you segregate
No, so there
what is
are, I mean,
spent on the house and what is spent on the product?
quite right. So, but in my view, I think if I may just put it, more detailed your documentation is, and you're able to segregate expenses, lesser the challenge that adjustment will be made. So,
you
while
will not be able to segregate. See, you have an ad budget. I am
okay.
advertising Tata Salt. Now, how much of that ad budget is attributable to Tata,
Quite
where
right.
I am only the economy holder, and how much is attributable to Salt, where I am the legal owner?
quite right.
This is the kind of thing which.
I appreciate. So, in a sense, if you look at and take your argument forward, when Crocin is a brand which is owned by the Indian company and the Glaxo is the brand which is a
Only
foreign
economic
entity,
owner.
economic owner,
Yeah.
the legal owner is outside India, and you are actually the legal and the economic owner of Crocin in India,
Yeah.
then that's not an AMP that should qualify for this discussion at all. That being said, so my sense is if you take this argument forward, you should segregate the two and say this is not even AMP which is
Yeah.
subject to transfer in the first place because I am the economic and the legal owner. And if that is not there, which is the starting point, then it is not even an international transaction.
I am using GlaxoSmithKline.
No, so
The
when
house
you are putting advertisements for Crocin as a brand, and that brand is yours, legal and the economic ownership, then I can't seem to see the contention coming about saying this is an AMP which is subject matter of transfer pricing in the first place. But yes, of course, you need to do that exercise of segregation, in fact.
In the accounting level, that has to be taken care of.
Yes.
Your SAP system or whatever
Yes.
system is there.
Quite right. And it is, I think, so accountants probably think that everything is possible. Even if you give us a mass of data, we will dissect and bisect everything and come up with what is really spent for what. So we don't think that's a big challenge, but lawyers may not think that way. So that comes to the reporting requirement, as we discussed a while ago, is that whether AMP expenses to be reported separately or together with primary transactions, example import of goods, and whether the entire amount of AMP expenses to be reported or considered subsumed in the primary transaction. So I think the practical view would be that in the light of what is now developed as somewhat of a position that is there, whether we like it or not, my sense is we would, as a conservative tax practitioners, end up reporting the entire AMP as an expenditure and put out in your transfer pricing reporting. Any view on the subject?
Sorry?
Sir, if we justify the AMP expenses incurred by us, that actually helped us in earning more revenue, that is more sales. Then in that case, there should not even be some, what you say, the right line test or any other ways to.
No, that is actually the way it is that the very fact that you spend money on brand building or it is actually to promote your sales. So the benefit, if the benefit was not there, why would you even want to spend anything over here? So clearly that's the perspective, but I think that now seems to be an argument that has lived its life, that itself is not a starting point. Now we have to find out that the fact of the matter that you are spending AMP and when you are not the legal owner, can you justify the transfer pricing or the arm's length price? I think that's where we are at this point of time, is that the argument that actually my sales increase because of AMP is not the discussion left on the table anymore.
But isn't it that if you spend on promoting sales, that's not considered non-routine and it will not go into your transfer pricing concept?
Quite right. So my view of this subject of this routine and non-routine started with bright line test is actually buried, if I put it this way at this point of time, is that you really don't need to go into this arithmetic to say what is routine and what is non-routine, which was the mandate of the bright line test, and that being disregarded by the High Court. I think we can move on.
Is it disregarded for only for licensed manufacturer
For
or
the-
even for distributors?
No, I think if I may read the comments of the High Court or the observation of the High Court, it speaks of reverse of the situation of a distributor, that there is nothing like bright line test in the Indian transfer pricing regulation. So how come this whole thing is being made out that in every case you apply a bright line test which is not part of the regulations? So in other words, in my view is that,
right.
so in my view it is, even for a licensed manufacturer, as much as a distributor, bright line test is dead. Right. Then again, document requirements, establish the distribution and marketing functions are interlinked. In case the taxpayer claims aggregation or transaction, as you observed that you would need to bring about that they are interlinked together, the distribution and the marketing expenditure is there. And establish distribution and marketing functions being remunerated as a package also needs to be demonstrated. And I think that is something that is practically being done as companies do this international transaction. Is that whenever there are large imports from a foreign name where the brand is, the legal owner is outside India, they support the Indian company by subsidizing the price. So this is something that happens practically in every situation. So I'm not of the view that this cannot be really met with practically as we practice the transfer pricing after this particular case has been set out.
As on today, what is now option left with the TPO? If he does not accept the aggregation, then what he can do? How can he determine the MP?
I think the fundamental of transfer pricing is that as long as the taxpayer is able to demonstrate that despite everything that is there in the domain of international transactions, he's been able to prove that there is an arm's length justification of everything there, the controversy must cease. You cannot find different ways to attack a taxpayer to say how do you make him unhappy. That's not the perspective. Is that you need to settle that saying if there's an AMP which is there, which is justified, there's a benchmark available, you need to stop here as a transfer pricing officer. So when you lost this match and you lost this particular argument, but then you need to move on. Is that this is not something you should keep on attacking, because finally, if that is being met with, so, and it doesn't resolve everything. If I may put it again, is that take a situation of loss. What would really unfold in a situation of loss is going to be a challenge even now. So it's not that there is an absolute green wicket out here that everything is resolved. There are going to be pockets of disputes that may still continue. But the starting point is not to find out different ways to attack a taxpayer, is my view. So therefore, I would probably say that the tax department now need to take a backseat on this particular subject.
In fact, how do we defend ourselves in this case, like a loss?
Quite right. So that's the challenge that remains on the table even now, is that you would need to functionally go and show what is the adjustment that you need to make, that despite the loss situation being there, you are still able to meet with the arm's length price. It's going to be a challenge. When a loss situation is there, this is never an easy perspective. But that's even there outside of AMP. I'm not saying that AMP is something that is different than a loss situation which is outside of an AMP situation. We all have the same challenges, and then we need to do what we need to do to make up for the losses and still justify that we are in arm's length in terms of the price that we pay for the international transactions.
I think we have got many issues to discuss, so let's proceed.
Yeah, but this was probably the most important. I kind of had this apprehension that this would get the largest attention. The rest are not so difficult, but let's move on. I take your suggestion, Naresh. We spent good time on this. Thank you. So location savings is the next one. Again, this is something we see all the time, is that there is an AE which engages the Indian taxpayer for providing a contract R&D service. And of course, India is a low-cost jurisdiction, and also there are subsidies available for setting up manufacturing base in different parts of the country. And all of this entail a location saving as you set up shop in India for manufacturing or R&D or anything of the sort. So the controversy is that allocation of taxing rights of cost savings due to reallocation of low-cost jurisdiction is something that is put up by the tax department. So what are the contention of the taxpayer is that the location savings is attributable to the EE due to the risk-bearing entrepreneurial nature of the EE. So this is not something that I should benefit from, is that if there is a saving then on account of setting up base in India, that is not my saving, it is the saving of the foreign entity which decides to contract manufacture with me, because the risk is of something going wrong is with him and not with me. Number one. Location saving is available to all the local comparables, is that I am not the only person who gets the benefit. The benefit is available even to my comparable. So in a sense, the comparison itself is going to be odious in a situation that both of us are on the same level playing field. So how do you see that I am at a more advantageous position as opposed to my comparable? That's the second argument. The third is the savings already factored in the operating margins, is that I consume this saving as I bring my margins in the international transaction. And in a competitive environment, in most cases, location saving is passed on to the end customer. So what is alleged by the tax department over here is something that is probably economically non-existential, is that things move very quickly, is that if India is a service provider or China is a manufacturer, very quickly we'll see within 3 or 4 months or 6 months of time, all the competitors setting base in India and China respectively for services or manufacturing. And the location advantage that I'm able to go to a low-cost jurisdiction to manufacture or get services sourced from there doesn't remain for a long period of time. So that being said, it actually goes back to the customer, because if, for example, if Apple wants to manufacture Apple phones, it may go to Taiwan or it may go to China. It never manufactures in Palo Alto where the headquarters is, and continue to remain uncompetitive as the cell phones. It doesn't happen like that. So for example, everything is globalized, manufacturing is absolutely globalized in the world today. Services are also getting about in the same zone, is that most of the services go to low-cost jurisdictions where the services are actually being rendered at a lower cost. Same way manufacturing is gone to China. So how can you have an advantage which is more, how can you be more advantageous than a competitor? Because even a competitor is also getting the same benefit. So it should not really exist, in other words. So therefore, after all of this, there should be no additional attribution and degree adjustment for the net margins is the case of the taxpayer. As opposed to that, the revenue contends that the benefits of to the aid due to location savings should be accrued to taxpayer at least partly, and general allocations could be 50% of overall location savings made to Indian taxpayer. And of course, the tax department is placing reliance on the UNTP manual for additional allocation of location savings that India has put out in the manual as its own piece over here. What is India's position on this subject, that there is a location saving that India should benefit from. The point here is that here, despite the fact that the margins justify the ALP, you are going one step above and say no, but there should be more attribution of income, which is beyond even the benchmark. That's what the whole contention. This is not the principle of transfer pricing in the first place. The location saving, in the context of how it is being alleged to be practiced in India, is not the concept of transfer pricing. So there is a decision of Watson Pharma, where Watson Pharma India was the company which is in the which was actually doing this contract R&D in India. And once the margin of the taxpayer, so what is that has been held by Bombay Tribunal is interesting on the subject. Is that once the margins of the taxpayer commensurate with comparables under TNMM, AE's benefit not relevant. That's what is the issue, is that as long as I'm able to benchmark the Indian entity and I've justified the benchmarking, then location saving discussion is not relevant anymore. In a perfectly competitive market, there is no super profit in the supply chain. Therefore, additional PP adjustment for location saving is not warranted. As in the example I gave you of Apple or any of the services organization, this particular location saving actually remains for a very short period of time, even if it is there, is that you are not so smart that your company doesn't understand that by manufacturing in China you could save a lot of money and you can continue manufacturing in other part of the world and you still remain competitive. It's not happening. Everyone manufactures in the location where it is cheapest to manufacture. And the UNTP manual view of the Indian tax administration is not binding on the appellate authorities. That's what the tribunal said. And also in context of that, place reliance on the OECD guidelines, which actually says that the benefit is actually consumed in the margin. Therefore, there is no separate benchmarking required for the additional profit attribution that is there beyond the arm's length price. Alright, so this is what is a location saving as a subject and the current outcome of that. Somewhat in the favor of I would say largely tilting in the favor of the taxpayer. Of course, I would not disregard the overwhelming stress on documentation to support what you say. So here is a checklist of number of things you must do to support your case: robust documentation, comprehensive functional analysis, detailed functional analysis of the comparables. You must also do a comparison of location advantages for taxpayer vis-a-vis your comparables. Also, that the fact that the benefit of the locations is already being passed to the end consumers, and detailed industry analysis to provide insight into stage of maturity of market competitiveness, which, as I said, is a very short period of time. The market matures very quickly, and therefore this advantage really doesn't remain in the system. That you can kick it off saying it remains year over year. That's an attribution need to be made to this. So, as a starting point, if I go back to say that this location saving as an allegation in the first place was beyond the benchmark or the ALP as a concept, outside the realm of transfer pricing, so to speak, to say, can you attribute more income even as you meet with an arm's length price, which is a location saving, which was being argued by tax department. I think more or less we are coming to an even position to say that this argument cannot sustain. Infusion of share capital, I think even before I start, I think this subject is, in my view, almost now reached a conclusion, but for academic discussion, we may just quickly run through this because it may have overhang and also some takeaways for similar transition that may come about in future. Is that what really happens in a situation where there are capital account transactions? Would this principle that are laid in the Vodafone case be carried to those? And I think my view is yes, it could be taken as that is that if there is no income in the first place, if it's a capital account transaction, Chapter 9 does not, although a code by itself, it cannot override what is the concept of income in the first place. So I think that's what the key principles of Vodafone's decision is on the subject, is that, and I will not spend much time for the amount of time that is left now on the particular facts of this case, is that it started with making an adjustment when an equity infusion was being made by the AE to an Indian company. There was a valuation difference that was there in the outset. The price at which the AE brought money into India as opposed to what the tax department thought it should have brought money into India were different. The valuation methods and the assumptions were made were different. Valuation method probably was the same, but the assumptions were different. And not only it wanted to make a primary adjustment, it also wanted to make a secondary adjustment. And the shortfall in the premium was recharacterized as loan also. So there are several adjustments that were made by the tax department. Of course, the taxpayer's argument was that issue of share was not an income and therefore not covered under Section 92 as a starting point. And share premium received is anyway cannot be taxed in India in the first place. And even if you discover that there is a disproportion in the premium that you receive from the AE, it is still not an income in the first place. The valuation report should be accepted as a valid benchmark, is what the contention of the taxpayer was. And the secondary adjustment was not provided in the regulation in the first place. So that was the argument of the taxpayer. As opposed to that, the revenue authorities came about saying capital financing transactions are included in the new definition as amended with effect from 1st April 2002. And share issue is a capital financing and hence is an international transaction as per the new definition. And CCI guidelines, which was what the taxpayer was relying, is not enough for a TP regulation just as much as that. The valuation which was made by Vodafone in this particular situation was based on CCI guidelines. The transfer pricing officer's view was that you cannot apply CCI guidelines to transfer pricing. It's a different valuation principle out here, and we may not want to go by the CCI guidelines as a benchmark itself. And undervaluation actually results in diminution of the wealth of the taxpayer. That was the primary concern of the tax authorities and also a justification for making the adjustment. But then again, the decision was quite emphatic, made this great distinction to say what is income, and the fact that income arising from international transaction is a condition precedent for Chapter 9. Tax can only be charged on income. In absence of income, no question of testing ALP. Therefore, Chapter 9 is not a code by itself in a sense that anything could be taken into account. So something that is not an income under the Income Tax Act becomes an income under the Chapter 9 is not something that is conceivable. That's what the Bombay High Court had to say on the subject. And capital account transaction are not income, that's what it said. And coverage of Section 92B should have no impact on, the share issue should not have an impact on this particular subject. And of course, we all know that Supreme Court also was not in favor of this, and government accepted HC order and did not file SNP before Supreme Court. So, not being said in the media that we've heard in terms of the non-adversarial tax regime that the Modi government is promising for the last 9 months or 10 months plus. This is one more step in the direction. Of course, controversies refuse to die. New controversies keep coming. The current one, of course, is MAT. Hopefully, we'll again see an end to this in the benefit of the country, because, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, is that all these tax controversies that start, they became so huge. The entire country, all taxpayers, tax advisors, the entire fraternities engaged in this huge discussion does not translate anything in front of it as anything like a tax as such, as a revenue, but the Indian economy loses out big time on FDI. It doesn't come in because of the confidence that is not coming in for the foreign investors. So yet again, one more situation we have in front of us as MAT, but I think this actually, I would say thankfully got resolved very swiftly and died down before it became another huge issue.
So just small
limited to fresh issue of share.
Correct.
Other share transaction
That will be subject to transfer pricing, yes. Yes. Because that could be an income attribution in those cases, because it's a question of capital again over there, as opposed to this was something that was behind. Sure.
So just here it is mentioned share issue not covered under Section 92B since no impact on profit, income, losses or assets.
Correct.
So is it that it is not covered under the definition of international transaction and we don't need to report?
But that's what it means, because if you're saying it is not an income in the first place, share issue is not an income.
No, but it is falling in the definition of international transaction because capital financing transactions are covered.
So there are definitions of capital financing transactions which are there. The view that could be taken is that issue of fresh shares is not a capital financing transaction.
No, it is additional issue of shares. I mean, it is not
Yeah,
initial.
correct. So whether it's additional issue or a fresh issue, it's an issue of shares, which is not an income under the income tax law. What is not income under the income tax law cannot be subject to transfer pricing. Therefore, 92B should strictly say, therefore not even cover those transactions.
So basically that particular clause is ultra vires.
No, it's not. It's a capital financing transaction. I'll just take it out for you what it actually covers. So, just for your information, as per subclause C of explanation 1 to section 92B, capital financing includes any type of long-term or short-term borrowing, lending or guarantee, purchase or sale of marketable securities, any type of advance, payments of deferred payment or receivable or any other debt arising during the course of business. That's the definition of capital financing as such. So that being said, but can you also include fresh issue of shares in this capital financing transaction? And I think that's the view that we need to take is, when you say it's not an income, this is not capital financing transaction. The department wanted to extend that after 1/4/2012, we can touch anything even including shares. That's not what it is. So we have any view on this subject?
So because department can take a view that since capital financing is covered, so you report it as an international transaction, and then how it is at ALP to prove that you take a stand that 92(1) is not applicable. 92B is applicable, but 92 subsection 1 is not applicable. So we need to report it, and then we can take a stand that it is at ALP because 92(1) is not applicable.
No, but if Bombay High Court has been very clear about this. This is not even covered by transfer regulations. So why would you want to step in and say still is an international transaction?
Because 92B is still not amended. If
No, there is no need to amend 92B because the scope of 92B is not something that the tax, as per the tax authorities has been made out. It has a very different meaning of capital financing transaction which I just read. So therefore, if it is not a capital financing transaction in the first place as the definition provides, which unfortunately got extended by the transfer pricing officers or the authorities, why would you want to still want to put it in the documentation and then again say that no, but it's not international transaction?
So it is possible that there can be penalty because of this ground, because this is something which is very vague, I mean, as on today. Because department can clearly say that in definition of international transaction, how you do interpret that there has to be income. Income part is in 92(1), it is not in 92B.
So I do appreciate that, we as accountants want to err on the conservative side and we want to still report it as a transaction and still say that, it is not covered because it's not an income. I mean, so of course you can take a conservative approach in reporting so that there are no penalty exposure, and when you advise your client or, you're taking a position on behalf of a client, you would want to see that every step is taken to mitigate potential tax risk over there. But on a theory basis, I don't think it is required. Although, as I said, accountants tend to be on the conservative side. I really don't think this is necessary to report anymore. Any view here? Ready?
Yeah, because see, tax law is interpreted literally.
Correct.
If it's not within the definition of capital gain,
I think so. I mean, my view would be the same, but
there's no
unfortunately, what
purposive construction.
yeah. So, unfortunately, what happens is that when we offer advice to our clients, we always say, but what is the tax officer still wants to contend, and therefore why don't we report it? That's what the view we would normally want to take on a subject. But is that the correct view? Answer is conservative, possibly not a correct view.
Because even if we report, there is no harm because now it is a settled issue.
That I appreciate. So I'm saying there are two things over here. That practically we want to do something to bring a conservative position, but actually it's not required anymore.
Then we are encouraging the tax officers to continue to push that.
Yeah, but I would go with this view because if I was to advise my client, I'm always afraid that, despite my limited understanding of transfer pricing, the transfer pricing authority always know better how interpretation need to be brought about. And I have a surprise coming after 2 years of tax in the audit to say that, this actually was not that way. You imagine that, look at the another decision that has come, which says something different, where I'm probably not prepared for it. So I would just probably want to keep my options open. That's what I would have done. Knowing that, I'm also contending that I'm reporting a transaction, but I believe it is an income and therefore not, it's not income and therefore I don't need to really bring about a justification on the arm's length price. I would not go expend energy to do a DC evaluation to support that and all of those kind of things. I might not do in the documentation, but I would still report. That's probably a practical approach.
In my opinion also, in this case, Vodafone,
yes,
the whole argument turned on this Salve's remark. You are not taxing the premium which is charged. So why are you want to tax the premium which is reportedly not charged?
Exactly.
That would be a very powerful
No, I appreciate. So the difficulty in our country is that despite there are very powerful arguments, and they are reported also, they are actually accepted by the judicial authorities, even in something like a High Court, we are still hesitant out of the sheer fear which new interpretation will come about and dislodge our position. So that's, I think, something that we have practically learned over a period of time to be conservative. I think we are not able to shake that, if you ask me. We are not, sorry?
That's true to a certain extent. I mean, even in income tax, for example, there's a Supreme Court ruling that LTA documents don't need to be taken by the company.
Correct.
But companies are still insisting on it just to avoid harassment
so
on that account.
that's what I'm saying. So, we still don't want to shake off. I think the fear psychosis is so large is that what next surprise will come and which decision will overturn something that seems to be settled position or something, or amendment may come retrospective, anything can happen.
The same view can be considered for fresh issue as well as additional issue?
Yes, I think the position remains same, is that either of the issue, it is not income in the first place, so how can it be, how can it change the position? Alright, recharacterization of transaction as a concept, let me start with that, and then again we'll go very, I think we've got another 10 minutes. Yeah, alright, so I think, sorry? So some point of time the hunger for knowledge is to stop and hunger for food has to start, so this is 10 minutes. Alright, so we talked about recharacterization of transaction, again a concept that is not there in the transfer pricing regulation in the first place. You cannot recharacterize transaction, there is nowhere in the law and the regulation to speak of that transfer pricing authorities can recharacterize the transaction as something different, which happened in the case of share application as a concept, and we all know what happened after that is that the share application, which was there for a longer duration, was taken as a loan, and there was an attribution of interest on that, and then after that what happened is that what the decision of Bharti Airtel really set out to say is that ALP could be interest potentially payable to an unrelated share applicant on delayed allotment of shares, if at all. But its application cannot be pari material with interest bearing loan. So that's what's the tenet of the discussion. But it brings us to an interesting position and a point over here is that can a tax officer or tax transfer pricing officer recharacterize a transaction or not? I think that's a big issue out here in my view. It's not just this particular transaction that recharacterize, which was share application as a loan, but can you do this as a concept or not? But I also see that happening now with OECD in the next paper, I think probably Kevin would have covered, is that it is coming into the domain of transfer pricing to give the power to the tax authorities to recharacterize a transaction. So that's a big issue out here in my view, is that you are giving a power to the authorities to recharacterize a transaction as something which is not as a starting point, because how is transfer pricing practice across the world at this point of time is purely on a simple theories that is the transaction is arm's length or not, that's a period. There is nothing that you can do beyond that to recharacterize as something else which is not what it is in the first place. That is not the power of the officer, it is the power of the, at best, the assessing officer, if at all there is a grievance and a challenge out there. So that comes to intra-group transactions and group sorry.
This recharacterization in the absence of anti-FinCap legislation here.
Correct.
I mean, how would a TPO look at this FinCap if he is not allowed to recharacterize?
No, my point is this only, is that given that we do not have FinCap regime in the first place, yes, but the question is that you look at the transaction the way it is and find out whether it is an arm's length or not. You do not characterize something which it is not at the outset. So if you take the liberty of recharacterizing the share capital as a loan, and then you start benchmarking as what should be the opportunity cost of interest and so on and so forth, you are going into a different realm of subject. What you should do is that, would any share application be there which is not converted into shares for a long period of time, which is a comparable transaction? Of course, you don't find those transactions, which is of course a non-starter in the first place. But having said that, that's what you should restrict yourself to. And if at all there is a challenge and there is something that needs to be done, this is not the power of the transfer pricing officer. This is, if at all, is a power of the AO and not the TPO. I think this subject would answer that as we go forward. One of those to say that. So again, intra-group services has been again a matter of big debate. What is the way to look at this? The benefit test is a big challenge out here. The combined benchmarking using TNMM6, so the argument of the taxpayer with us is that the combined benchmarking using TNMM6 all transitions closely linked to core businesses. Services that we receive from the parent helps us in smooth functioning of our businesses, and we have documented evidence to prove our genuineness, and the revenue should not question the commercial wisdom that we put forward as we pay this money. And the revenue, as opposed to the demands, the transfer pricing, if I put it, is asking for, of course, a comprehensive voluminous documentation and stress of benefit test. And demonstration of actual receipt of service is something that is conventionally asked in transfer pricing audit. And inquiring into intra-group transfer pricing policy also happens as that happens. And they also want to find out the verification of cost allocation workings and so on and so forth. In many cases, TPO take ALP as nil in such cases and therefore make adjustment of the entire amount. So it started with the decision that was unfavorable to the taxpayer. There was GEM plus, where what the court held that this payment is not at arm's length and it has to be commensurate with the volume and quality of service received, and adequate documentation of benefits was not maintained by the taxpayer in that particular situation. So the onus was on the taxpayer to demonstrate that the management fee is commensurate with the volume and quality of service. There again we have a decision on the case of McCann Erickson, whether it was difficult for the taxpayer to operate successfully without receiving of the service from the AE, and the benefit test was adequately demonstrated. So this, despite the fact that the benefit test was taken as a concept, the taxpayer was able to demonstrate the benefit over here, and therefore the intra-group service was held to be at the arm's length price. But that's not the end of this. Cushman and Wakefield is another case that came about of the Delhi High Court in this particular case. I think this has really changed the position on what is a way to look at it, is that a TPO cannot determine whether there is a service or not from a taxpayer as a benefit or not. So benefit test is not the prerogative of the taxpayer, of the transfer pricing officer. The benefit test is a prerogative of the assessing officer. So what is really a benefit test is a subject matter of section 37(1) and not section 92. That being said, if a benefit test is really to be met with, it should be the realm of the assessing officer's domain to understand whether the benefit is actually there or not there, whether it qualifies that this expenditure is within the framework of section 37(1), and therefore transfer pricing officer should not get into this domain. Very important aspect, observation over here. Neither revenue or court must question the commercial wisdom of the taxpayer. However, the TPO has authority to determine ALP. So, confronted with the situation, there is an intra-group service that is being claimed by the taxpayer. All that the transfer pricing officer should really focus on is whether it is at the arm's length price or not, and nothing beyond. He cannot get inside the expense to say, show me the benefit, show me the documentation, and I need to see what is the benefit that you received, why did you pay this money, which is actually what we see happening day in and day out. So that's something that is not the mandate of the law. And of course, the interpretation suggests over here. And even if the service is a charge, expense allocated to taxpayer for on a pure cost-to-cost basis allocation, cost itself ought to be scrutinized and related to in relation to party to A's. So what it says over here is that the common refrain from the taxpayer is that as you pay the intra-group services, what you're really reimbursing is only the cost, and there is no markup given to that. To which the High Court said that as you claim that there is only cost, it is also important to understand how the cost is arrived at. So you can't take away for the officer to examine how the cost is really being brought about to be debited to you. That's an important test. And he of course spoke about saying, can you do a percentage allocation, advisable not? Should you go into looking at what is the specific allocation of cost vis-a-vis the cost intra-group service? I think that's something High Court put out emphatic rejoinders to this, to say that this is something that should be looked upon, not the domain of the transfer pricing officer, it's a domain of the assessing officer to apply the benefit test.
Are there any decisions which have upheld the aggregation approach?
In terms of
See, I have multiple transactions with my AE. In that,
Correct.
one of the elements is management cost, which generally happens.
Correct.
So my profitability is sufficiently higher than comparables, and I am saying this transaction is aggregated.
Correct.
So whether any courts have upheld this kind
So,
of thing?
I mean, my sense is that in many cases we end up applying aggregation as a principle because we don't go by transition to transition, although it's an advisable approach. We always end up discovering we do not have comparables that have the same FAR, and therefore we fall back on TNM in most cases. So, in a sense, it's an aggregation of approach. Again, develop documentation that you should maintain, and again, this is more of fear psychosis, maybe not relevant from a section 92 perspective, but a relevant proposition from a section 37 perspective. Now that it has been shifted from the TPO to AO, you might still want to maintain this part of readiness of documents with you. One more case, selection of foreign tested party, whether we can use a foreign tested party as a to do benchmarking. So take this case of A Limited, which is an Indian company which manufactures and sells chemicals. It has got 3 subsidiaries, one in USA, one in Spain, and one in Bangladesh. So the US company is actually marketing and selling chemicals as an import from A Limited. The Spain company actually processes the chemicals and sells the resultant finished product, whereas the Bangladesh company actually purchases the chemicals in bulk, repacks and sells in the local market. So there are different ways in which the import actually translates into sales for the foreign subsidiaries. The question is that in the situation that these three subsidiaries have got different ways of making profit. One is of marketing and distribution, second is of import, and third is repacking as well as import and then selling in smaller packets. So A is currently benchmarks all sales on transaction using CPM. Comparison of gross margins from sale to A with gross margins from sale to third party customers is the starting point. For sales to Z Bangladesh, gross margins of A Limited are lower than the benchmark. That's a challenge over here, is that when it comes to Bangladesh, it's not able to meet with these benchmarks. That's a challenge. And Z is a new entrant and needs support in the penetrative pricing strategy. Just as we saw in the AMP discussion, same reverse strategy from an Indian perspective. As a group would become incumbent in the Bangladesh market, the issues are from a benchmarking options is, can A Limited select foreign AE as a tested party, and can A Limited selectively treat only Z Bangladesh as tested party and treat transition with Z and ALP since Z Bangladesh incurs losses. This is a big question out here, is that what you are asking for is there are a same set of transactions, but there are three different A's out here who are actually buying from you. Can you use different tested party in those three different situations? Because that's how you could still have a chance to justify your arm's length pricing. So Indian TP regulation do not define tested party and there is no guidance on the same. OECD also is only asking for one thing, that is least complex functional analysis is the basis to select a tested party. But the tested party could be a foreign or a local party. Same says UNTP manual also. There were decisions in the case of Onward Technologies which said that selection of foreign A's as a tested party is not permitted as per Indian TP regulations. Now that's a big statement to make in a decision as that. Whereas in Network C, again it said foreign A's can be selected as tested party. Come to this development consultants case, taxpayers rendered engineering service to two such foreign A's and consider one foreign A as tested party, and for transaction with the other A, intercompany transaction only 6 or 7% of the A's total, and hence testing of the A's margin was rejected. The taxpayers were considered itself as a tested party for this transaction, and this actually was accepted by the tribunal in a situation is that for the same transaction, for two different A's were taken. So in one case a foreign company was taken as the tested party, in the other the Indian company was taken as a tested party, it was accepted by the tribunal. That's the short point. In other words, we have the freedom to choose which should be the tested party in a given situation, going by the simpler logic to say which is the least complex functions.
Would the same taxpayer consider itself as the tested party?
So what happened in the first case, the foreign AE was considered as a tested party. In the second situation, since the AE's, the transaction that was sold to the AE, the foreign AE, was only 6 to 7% of its total transaction, it chose to treat itself as a tested party.
Okay.
I think the language is not
It took itself as a
coming out.
benchmark.
Yes, essentially that. For the reason is that if you were to use that tested party, only 6 and 7% of that was considered transaction with the Indian company. Therefore, it could not have been used as a tested party. That's all.
So, considering the fact that Onward Technology is the latest decision of Mumbai Tribunal, and there is a literal interpretation of law which the tribunal has done,
right,
by referring the exact wording in the rules, that Indian company cannot be taken as a tested party. What is your advice? What we should do?
No, my sense is I can't seem to find anywhere in the regulations to say that it should be only Indian party that it should be treated as a tested party. I would go with the view is that any entity which is the least complex function, that should be allowed to be used as a tested party, and it could be a foreign entity as well.
But how did the court give this decision? Did they cite any section or?
Yes, they have interpreted the rules.
Yeah, so they have come up with saying this can be the way to look at it, is that as the tribunal took a view is that surprisingly to say that the regulations suggest that only Indian party should be used as a tested party, but I probably don't see that as an interpretation that could be justified. Okay.
Can't think of anything.
No, I can't seem to think, because this is the different logic, because tested party could be anyone. So again, analysis of potential approaches, foreign days could be selected as tested parties if function analysis permit. Different tested parties can be selected for transaction with different days if facts warrant. Reliable information on comparables will be difficult to obtain in jurisdictions such as Bangladesh. Of course, that's a challenge that we all understand. And if a taxpayer has numerous A's, revenue could rely on Renbex's case to claim that taxpayers should be tested should be the tested party. But of course, detailed functional and economic evidence of utmost importance. I think that's what it is. And I think very quickly I'll take you to the last one. One quick short. Deep international transaction. Here is a case that you superimpose another entity between yourself and by putting another contract manufacturer inside. And what you end up doing is, if I just take you to the table, you end up pushing a higher profit to the AE by this particular transaction. And what you do is that you have a contract manufacturer in India to whom you sell at a lower price, and it sells lower price to the AE, which you otherwise could not have done directly. So what you can't do directly because of the regulations, can you do it indirectly or not? That's the position. There is a issue which has been put up. The caution area is to, of course, ensure that transactions with third party are also at ALP. And if compliance are not undertaken, penal implications may be applicable to the taxpayer. So I think this could become a challenge going forward. Just if you keep it at something that seems very obvious on the take, is that you're exposing to a risk to say that someone can take a position that this is a big international transaction that should be subjected to the same ALP test, and therefore what you're doing in this process is that you're actually giving away more profits to the by superimposing a contract manufacturing in between. So I think that's what it is over here. So with this last slide, thank you very much for your patient listening. It was a privilege for myself to be here in front of you and share this little experience that I have of this transactions. Thank you.
In the case of intra-bank services, how the benefit is also total inside, particularly in case of management services, the whole purpose is that they business